The mahogany conference table gleamed under the crystal chandelier as members of the Westfield family gathered in the prestigious law offices of Pemberton, Hayes, and Associates. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline stretched endlessly, but inside this room, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. At the head of the polished table sat Evelyn Westfield, the family matriarch, her silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon that matched her expression. To her right, her son Marcus adjusted his Armani suit and checked his Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. His wife Vivian sat beside him, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she drummed manicured fingers against the leather portfolio before her. On the opposite side of the table, almost as if deliberately isolated, sat Rachel Chun. Her simple black dress and modest jewelry stood in stark contrast to the designer wardrobe surrounding her. She had married into this family 3 years ago, and in all that time, she had never quite found her place among them. While they spoke of country club memberships and European vacations, she talked about shift schedules and equipment maintenance protocols at the manufacturing plant where she worked as a supervisor. As we watch this scene unfold, I have to ask, where are you watching this from today? Are you dealing with people who underestimate you based on your background? Let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from, because this story is about to show us all something powerful about hidden strengths. The heavy oak door opened with a quiet whisper, and Arthur Pemberton III entered the room. At 62, he commanded respect with his perfectly tailored gray suit and measured steps. Behind him came his associate, a younger woman carrying a thick file marked with the seal of the Washington State Superior Court. The tension in the room immediately intensified as family members straightened in their chairs. "Good afternoon, everyone," Pemberton said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in estate law. "Thank you all for gathering today for the reading of Theodore Westfield's last will and testament. As you know, Mr. Westfield was very specific about having all beneficiaries present for this proceeding." Evelyn's lips pursed at the mention of beneficiaries, her steely gaze flickering toward Rachel with barely concealed disdain. Marcus cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Pemberton, before we begin, I think we need to address something. My father may have been, shall we say, overly generous in his final years. We want to ensure that his true intentions are honored, particularly regarding individuals who may not have the educational background or business acumen to properly manage significant assets." The words hung in the air like poison. Rachel felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She had endured 3 years of these subtle and not-so-subtle jabs about her background. While Marcus held an MBA from Wharton and Vivian boasted a degree from Vassar, Rachel had what they considered a working-class education. She had completed her training at a technical institute and worked her way up through various manufacturing positions before landing her current supervisory role. Vivian's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What Marcus is trying to say is that some people in this room might not understand the complexities of managing substantial wealth. We're talking about business decisions that require serious educational credentials and proven intellectual capability." Her eyes fixed on Rachel with predatory precision. "Some of us have spent our entire lives preparing for these responsibilities through proper academic channels." Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent. She thought about her long days at the plant, troubleshooting complex machinery problems, coordinating with teams of skilled workers, analyzing production data and efficiency reports. None of that seemed to matter in this marble and mahogany world where pedigree trumped performance. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having the final word. "Theodore was always too soft-hearted for his own good. He saw potential where others saw limitations. However, I think we all agree that certain aspects of his estate require a level of sophisticated understanding that, frankly, not everyone in this room possesses." She turned to address Pemberton directly. "Is there any legal mechanism to ensure that inheritance decisions are made by those with appropriate qualifications?" The lawyer's expression remained professionally neutral, though Rachel caught a flicker of something that might have been disapproval in his eyes. "Mrs. Westfield, your husband's will was drafted with full consideration of all relevant factors. He was of sound mind and was quite explicit about his intentions regarding all beneficiaries." Marcus scoffed audibly. My father spent too much time listening to sob stories about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. The reality is that managing significant assets requires sophisticated knowledge of financial markets, tax implications, and business strategy. These aren't things you learn from trade school or factory work. His words stung because they echoed doubts Rachel had harbored about herself for years. When she had first met Theodore Westfield at a company safety conference, she had been intimidated by his wealth and status. But the elderly man had been genuinely interested in her insights about manufacturing efficiency and worker safety protocols. Over time, their professional relationship had developed into a mentorship of sorts, and eventually, he had introduced her to his nephew David, whom she later married. David had been different from the rest of his family, more grounded and appreciative of Rachel's practical knowledge and strong work ethic. But David had died in a car accident just 8 months ago, leaving Rachel to face his family's barely concealed resentment alone. Pemberton opened the sealed document with formal precision. Theodore Westfield's last will and testament was executed 6 months before his death, well within the period when medical evaluations confirmed his complete mental competency. He paused and looked around the table. The will contains several specific bequests, but I should note that one of the primary inheritances involves the controlling interest in Westfield Advanced Manufacturing, including all associated patents, facilities, and research divisions. The room fell completely silent. Westfield Advanced Manufacturing was the crown jewel of the family empire, a company that had evolved from traditional manufacturing into cutting-edge aerospace and defense contracting. The patents alone were worth millions, and the government contracts provided steady, lucrative income. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, that settles it then. Obviously, Dad intended for me to take over the technical divisions. I've been preparing for this responsibility my entire career. But Pemberton continued reading, his voice steady and measured. The controlling 51% stake in Westfield Advanced Manufacturing, including all patents, real estate, equipment, and ongoing contracts, is hereby bequeathed to Rachel Chin Westfield, with the express intention that she utilize her unique expertise to guide the company's continued growth and innovation. The silence that followed was deafening. Vivian's mouth fell open, her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her pale complexion. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Even Evelyn seemed momentarily stunned, her usual composure cracking just enough to reveal the shock underneath. "This is ridiculous," Marcus finally sputtered, his voice rising with each word. "She doesn't know the first thing about running a sophisticated manufacturing operation. She fixes broken machines and supervises shift workers. These are aerospace contracts we're talking about, government clearances, international trade regulations." Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar sensation she knew from the factory floor when a complex problem finally clicked into focus. She looked at Marcus with steady eyes and spoke for the first time since entering the room. "Actually, Marcus, those government contracts you mentioned involve very specific engineering tolerances and material specifications that require hands-on understanding of manufacturing processes, not just theoretical knowledge from business school." Her voice carried a quiet confidence that seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. But before anyone could respond, Vivian's voice cut through the air with renewed venom. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, turning to address Pemberton as if Rachel weren't even present. "She thinks understanding some factory procedures qualifies her to run a multi-million-dollar aerospace company. This is why education matters. This is why credentials matter. You can't just fake your way through complex business operations." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Rachel felt that familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling she got when someone told her a machine couldn't be fixed or a problem couldn't be solved. She thought about all the late nights she had spent studying technical manuals, all the complex systems she had mastered, all the innovations she had quietly implemented that had saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in efficiency improvements. But she also knew that in this room, surrounded by these people with their prestigious degrees and inherited assumptions, her practical knowledge would be dismissed as easily as they had just dismissed her right to inherit what Theodore had intended for her to have. Pemberton cleared his throat and continued with the formalities, but the battle lines had been drawn. The family had made their position clear. They would not accept Rachel's inheritance without a fight, and they would use every weapon at their disposal, including her educational background, to prove she was unworthy of Theodore's trust. What none of them knew was that their assumptions about Rachel's qualifications were about to be challenged in ways they never could have imagined. The following morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the mood that had settled over the Westfield family like a suffocating blanket. Marcus had spent a sleepless night pacing his penthouse apartment, his mind racing with strategies to overturn what he saw as his father's catastrophic mistake. By 7 a.m., he was already on the phone with his sister Catherine, who lived in Boston and had flown in immediately upon hearing the shocking news. Within hours, the family had reconvened at Evelyn's sprawling Bellevue estate, the same house where Theodore had raised his children and built his manufacturing empire. The Persian rugs and oil paintings seemed to mock Rachel as she sat in the formal living room, surrounded by people who viewed her as an interloper who had somehow manipulated their way into wealth she didn't deserve. Catherine Westfield Morrison had arrived with her husband James, a corporate attorney who specialized in challenging estate decisions. Her sharp blue eyes and platinum blonde hair gave her an air of aristocratic authority that she wielded like a weapon. She wasted no time in laying out what she saw as the family's only reasonable course of action. Obviously, we cannot allow Dad's momentary lapse in judgment to destroy everything our family has built over 3 generations, Catherine declared, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to boardroom battles. She turned to address Rachel directly, her tone barely concealing her contempt. I'm sure you understand that inheriting a company like Westfield Advanced Manufacturing requires more than good intentions and a willingness to learn on the job. Marcus nodded vigorously from his position near the marble fireplace. Exactly. We're talking about a company that holds classified defense contracts, maintains relationships with NASA, and operates manufacturing facilities that require the highest levels of technical expertise. He gestured broadly, as if the obvious nature of his argument made further explanation unnecessary. She can barely spell MBA, let alone understand the complexities of aerospace engineering or international trade regulations. Rachel felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in these situations only provided more ammunition for her critics. Instead, she focused on the technical aspects of what they were discussing, mentally cataloging the inaccuracies in their assumptions about the company's operations. Vivian leaned forward from her position on the velvet sofa, her voice taking on a tone of false concern. We're not trying to be cruel, Rachel. We're simply being realistic about what's best for everyone involved, including you. Managing a company of this magnitude would be overwhelming for someone without the proper educational foundation. The stress alone could be devastating. The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rachel thought about the countless times she had worked 18-hour shifts to solve critical production problems, the nights she had spent reviewing technical specifications and safety protocols, the innovations she had quietly implemented that had improved both efficiency and worker safety. None of that seemed to matter in this room, where credentials on the wall carried more weight than results in the real world. James Morrison cleared his throat and opened the leather portfolio he had brought with him. I've been researching the legal precedents for challenging inheritance decisions based on competency issues. While the testator's mental state at the time of execution appears solid, we can argue that he was not fully informed about the beneficiary's qualifications when making his decision. He pulled out several documents and spread them across the coffee table with the precision of a surgeon. I took the liberty of obtaining Rachel's educational records through legitimate channels. As we suspected, her formal education ended with a certificate from Pacific Northwest Technical Institute, followed by various on-the-job training programs at manufacturing facilities. Rachel's stomach tightened as she watched him display her educational history like evidence in a criminal trial. The Technical Institute where she had studied had provided excellent training in manufacturing processes, quality control, and industrial safety. She had graduated at the top of her class and had immediately been recruited by several major companies. But in this room, her achievements were being presented as proof of her inadequacy. Catherine picked up one of the documents and examined it with theatrical skepticism. 2 years of technical training in manufacturing operations. No business courses, no financial management, no experience with corporate governance or strategic planning. She looked up at Rachel with what might have been pity if it weren't so clearly calculated. How could Dad have expected someone with this background to understand the complexities of running an aerospace company? Evelyn had remained silent during this presentation, but now she spoke with the authority of someone delivering a final verdict. I propose we arrange for a formal competency evaluation. We'll bring in experts in business management, aerospace engineering, and corporate finance to assess whether Rachel has the knowledge necessary to fulfill the responsibilities Theodore intended for her. Marcus's face lit up with satisfaction. That's perfect. We'll make it comprehensive, covering everything from technical specifications to financial projections to regulatory compliance. He turned to Rachel with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm sure you'll want to prove that you're qualified for this responsibility, right, Rachel? The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in medieval combat. Rachel knew that refusing would be interpreted as admission of incompetence, but accepting meant submitting to what was essentially a public humiliation designed to expose her supposed inadequacies. James Morrison began outlining the structure of their proposed evaluation. We'll start with basic business principles, move through financial management concepts, and then focus on the technical aspects of aerospace manufacturing. We'll need to test understanding of federal contracting procedures, quality assurance protocols, and advanced engineering concepts. As he spoke, Rachel found herself mentally working through the problems he was describing. Federal contracting procedures involved detailed knowledge of FAR regulations and FAR supplements, which she had studied extensively when helping her current company pursue government contracts. Quality assurance protocols in aerospace required understanding of AS9100 standards and statistical process control, areas where she had actually implemented significant improvements in her current role. Catherine continued the assault with renewed enthusiasm. We'll also need to assess understanding of international trade regulations, export control requirements, and technology transfer restrictions. These are areas where mistakes can result in federal criminal charges and the loss of all government contracts. Rachel's mind automatically began cataloging the relevant regulations. ETAR restrictions on technical data, EAR classifications for dual-use technologies, and the complex web of regulations governing the export of manufacturing equipment and processes. She had dealt with all of these issues in her current position, often serving as the primary liaison with compliance officers and government inspectors. But she remained silent, knowing that any attempt to demonstrate her knowledge would be dismissed as lucky guessing or superficial understanding. She could see in their faces that they had already decided she was incompetent. The evaluation was merely a formality designed to provide legal justification for their predetermined conclusion. Vivian delivered what she clearly intended as the killing blow. Let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. Rachel may be a perfectly competent factory supervisor, but that's a far cry from the sophisticated decision-making required to run a company like Westfield Advanced Manufacturing. She looked around the room for confirmation from the other family members. The aerospace industry requires people who can think strategically, understand complex technical concepts, and navigate regulatory environments that would overwhelm someone without proper academic preparation. The words stung because they echoed Rachel's own occasional moments of self-doubt. When she had first started working in manufacturing, she had sometimes felt intimidated by engineers with their advanced degrees and theoretical knowledge. But over time, she had realized that practical experience and problem-solving ability often mattered more than credentials when it came to actually getting things done. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts. I know several people who specialize in business competency evaluations. We can have this arranged within the week, and then we can move forward with more appropriate inheritance arrangements. The casual dismissal in his voice made it clear that he viewed the evaluation as a mere formality before redistributing the inheritance according to what he saw as more suitable criteria. Rachel realized that no matter how well she performed on their tests, they would find ways to interpret the results in favor of their preconceived conclusions. As the family continued to discuss the details of their proposed evaluation, Rachel found herself thinking about the specific technical challenges facing Westfield Advanced Manufacturing. The company was in the middle of developing new composite materials for next-generation aircraft components, a project that required understanding of molecular chemistry, materials science, and advanced manufacturing processes. The federal contracts they mentioned involved producing components that had to meet tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, with failure rates approaching zero. These weren't abstract business concepts that could be mastered through textbook study. They required deep understanding of both theoretical principles and practical applications, the kind of knowledge that came from years of hands-on experience with complex manufacturing processes. But as she looked around the room at the faces filled with smug satisfaction and barely concealed contempt, Rachel realized that her actual qualifications were irrelevant to these people. They had decided she was unworthy based on their assumptions about her background, and no amount of evidence would change their minds. The evaluation they were planning would be nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to humiliate her and provide legal cover for stealing what Theodore had intended for her to inherit. 3 days later, the family reconvened at Pemberton's law office for what Marcus had demanded be a complete review of the technical assets included in Rachel's inheritance. He had insisted that before any competency evaluation could be properly structured, they needed to understand exactly what knowledge would be required to manage the company's sophisticated operations. Arthur Pemberton had arranged for the company's technical documentation to be present, along with Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a patent attorney who specialized in aerospace and defense technologies. The conference room now overflowed with thick binders containing engineering specifications, patent applications, and government contract details that would determine the true scope of Rachel's inherited responsibilities. Marcus entered the room with the confidence of someone who believed victory was within reach. He had spent the previous 3 days consulting with aerospace industry contacts, preparing himself to demonstrate why technical leadership of Westfield Advanced Manufacturing required someone with his business education and strategic thinking abilities. Dr. Chen spread the patent portfolios across the expanded conference table, her precise movements reflecting years of experience with complex technical documentation. The Westfield Advanced Manufacturing patent portfolio consists of 47 active patents covering advanced composite materials, precision manufacturing processes, and specialized aerospace components, she explained in a crisp professional tone. Rachel found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the technical language in a way that surprised even her. She had always been fascinated by the intersection of materials science and manufacturing processes, often staying late at her current job to review technical specifications that weren't strictly part of her supervisory responsibilities. Marcus immediately moved to establish his authority over the proceedings. Obviously, I'll need to take the lead in understanding these technical assets so I can guide Rachel through the basics when necessary. He gestured dismissively toward the patent documents. She can sign whatever needs to be signed, but the strategic decisions will require someone with proper business training. Dr. Chen opened the first patent folder and began explaining the company's crown jewel, a revolutionary carbon fiber composite manufacturing process that had attracted attention from both NASA and the Department of Defense. The process involves precise temperature control during the curing phase, with tolerances measured in fractions of degrees across large surface areas, she said, pointing to complex diagrams that looked like engineering blueprints crossed with molecular chemistry. As Dr. Chen spoke, Rachel found herself studying the technical drawings with intense focus. The manufacturing process reminded her of challenges she had faced in her current position, but with far more sophisticated materials and much tighter specifications. She could see potential efficiency improvements in the curing cycle timing and questions about the thermal expansion coefficients of the substrate materials. Vivian interrupted with barely concealed impatience. Can we focus on the business implications rather than getting lost in technical details? What are these patents worth, and what kind of management expertise is required to maintain their value? Dr. Chen consulted her valuation summary. The total patent portfolio is conservatively valued at $38 million, but the real value lies in the exclusive manufacturing contracts they enable. The current aerospace contracts are worth approximately $120 million over the next 5 years. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the numbers settled in. Even Marcus seemed momentarily stunned by the scale of what they were discussing. Catherine broke the silence with a nervous laugh. Well, That certainly reinforces our position that this requires sophisticated management oversight. But as Dr. Chun continued her presentation, Rachel began to notice technical inconsistencies in the documentation. The thermal curing specifications seemed to assume atmospheric pressure conditions that wouldn't be optimal for the composite densities they were targeting. She found herself making mental calculations about the relationship between pressure, temperature, and curing time that suggested more efficient approaches. Dr. Chun moved to the next patent, describing a precision machining process for aerospace components with tolerances measured in micrometers. The process requires understanding of both material science and advanced manufacturing techniques, she explained, showing cross-sectional diagrams of components that had to fit together with absolutely perfect precision. Rachel studied the diagrams intently, her mind automatically analyzing the manufacturing challenges they represented. She could see where traditional machining approaches would struggle with the specified tolerances and began thinking about alternative fabrication methods that might achieve better results with less waste material. Marcus noticed her intense focus on the technical documents and felt compelled to reassert his authority. Rachel, I know this is all very overwhelming, but don't worry about understanding the details. I'll handle the technical aspects, and you can focus on whatever paperwork needs your signature. But Rachel was no longer listening to Marcus. She was absorbed in studying a patent for specialized fastening systems designed for high-stress aerospace applications. The design seemed to have a fundamental flaw in its approach to stress distribution that could lead to failure under certain loading conditions. Without thinking, she spoke up for the first time during the technical presentation. Dr. Chun, in patent number 42, the fastening system design. What analysis was done on stress concentration factors around the threaded interfaces under cyclic loading conditions? The room went dead silent. Dr. Chin looked up from her notes with surprise, clearly not expecting such a specific technical question from someone she had been told was a factory supervisor with limited technical knowledge. That's actually a very sophisticated question, Dr. Chin replied slowly, flipping through the technical appendices. The stress analysis was performed using finite element modeling, but you're right to be concerned about stress concentration. The threaded interfaces do represent potential failure points under high cycle fatigue conditions. Marcus's confident expression began to show cracks of uncertainty. How does a maintenance worker know about finite element analysis and stress concentration factors? He asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion rather than his usual dismissive certainty. Rachel looked up from the patent diagrams, her mind still processing the technical implications of what she was seeing. Stress concentration is a fundamental issue in any high-performance fastening application, she said matter-of-factly. If you don't account for the stress multiplication effects around geometric discontinuities, you'll get crack initiation and progressive failure under repeated loading cycles. Vivian stared at her sister-in-law as if she were speaking a foreign language. What are you talking about? Where did you learn these terms? But Rachel was already moving on to examine another patent, one describing advanced sensor systems for monitoring manufacturing processes. The sensor placement strategy seemed suboptimal for detecting the types of defects that would be most critical in aerospace applications. Dr. Chun, Rachel continued, still studying the technical drawings. The sensor array configuration in patent 36 seems to assume that defects will be randomly distributed, but in composite manufacturing, defects typically follow predictable patterns related to fiber orientation and resin flow characteristics. Wouldn't a more targeted sensor placement strategy provide better defect detection with fewer sensors? Dr. Chin's eyebrows rose significantly. You're absolutely correct. That's a very insightful observation about composite defect mechanisms. Most people wouldn't understand the relationship between manufacturing process variables and defect patterns. The family exchanged increasingly nervous glances as Rachel continued to demonstrate technical knowledge that seemed far beyond what her background should have provided. Catherine leaned forward with obvious concern. Rachel, where exactly did you learn about composite manufacturing and defect analysis? But Rachel was now completely absorbed in the technical documentation, her mind working through problems and solutions with the focused intensity that had always driven her to excellence in whatever she tackled. She began asking increasingly sophisticated questions about material selection criteria, process optimization strategies, and quality control methodologies that left Dr. Chen nodding with obvious professional respect. Pemberton, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, found himself directing more and more of the technical discussion toward Rachel rather than Marcus. Her questions were revealing deep understanding not just of individual technologies, but of how complex manufacturing systems work together as integrated wholes. Marcus made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Look, Rachel has obviously been doing some research since the will reading, but understanding a few technical terms doesn't qualify someone to manage a $100 million aerospace operation. Rachel finally looked up from the patents, her eyes meeting his with quiet confidence. Marcus, these aren't terms I learned from research. Process optimization and defect analysis are what I do every day. She gestured toward the technical documents spread across the table. The only difference is the scale and the materials involved, but the fundamental engineering principles are exactly the same. The room had grown so quiet that the distant Seattle traffic seemed to roar through the windows. For the first time since the inheritance had been announced, the family was beginning to realize that their assumptions about Rachel's capabilities might be fundamentally wrong. The following week brought Dr. Michael Harrison, a distinguished aerospace engineering consultant whom Marcus had specifically requested to evaluate the technical complexity of the inherited assets. Dr. Harrison arrived with an impressive resume that included 20 years at Boeing, followed by senior consulting work with NASA and several major defense contractors. His presence was meant to provide the definitive assessment of whether Rachel could possibly handle the sophisticated technical requirements of running Westfield Advanced Manufacturing. Marcus had orchestrated this meeting with theatrical precision, arranging for the consultation to take place in the company's main conference room rather than the law office. He wanted Rachel to see firsthand the overwhelming complexity of what she would be inheriting, surrounded by the actual manufacturing facility and technical equipment that she would supposedly be responsible for managing. The Westfield Advanced Manufacturing headquarters occupied a sprawling campus in the industrial district south of Seattle, with gleaming office buildings connected to vast production floors where the sound of precision machinery created a constant mechanical symphony. As the family gathered in the executive conference room, floor-to-ceiling windows provided views of the manufacturing floor below, where white-coat technicians moved between sophisticated equipment that looked more like scientific instruments than traditional factory machinery. Dr. Harrison spread his evaluation materials across the polished conference table with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to briefing executives and government officials. His gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of academic authority that Marcus clearly hoped would intimidate Rachel into acknowledging her own inadequacy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Harrison began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone comfortable with complex technical presentations. "I've spent the past week reviewing the Westfield Advanced Manufacturing patent portfolio and current production capabilities. What we're dealing with here represents some of the most sophisticated aerospace manufacturing technology currently in commercial production." Marcus leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction, confident that Dr. Harrison's assessment would provide the ammunition needed to challenge Rachel's inheritance. "Obviously, we want to ensure that whoever takes responsibility for these operations has the technical background necessary to maintain our competitive advantages and fulfill our contractual obligations." Dr. Harrison nodded and opened his first technical folder. "Let's start with the composite manufacturing processes. The current production line uses an automated fiber placement system capable of laying carbon fiber preforms with positional accuracy of plus or minus 0.02 of an inch." He gestured toward detailed schematics that showed robotic systems of bewildering complexity. "The process requires precise control of fiber tension, placement speed, and compaction pressure throughout the layup sequence." Rachel found herself studying the schematics with intense interest, her mind immediately recognizing inefficiencies in the current process parameters. The fiber placement speed settings seemed conservative for the type of carbon fiber being used, and the compaction pressure profile appeared to be optimized for older generation composite materials rather than the advanced systems now available. Dr. Harrison continued his presentation, moving to thermal processing requirements. The autoclave curing process operates at temperatures up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, with pressure cycles reaching 100 pounds per square inch. The cure cycle must be precisely controlled to achieve proper cross-linking in the polymer matrix while avoiding thermal degradation of the carbon fiber reinforcement. As he spoke, Rachel noticed a fundamental error in the pressure-temperature relationship he was describing. The cure cycle parameters he outlined would work for standard aerospace composites, but they weren't optimized for the specific polymer chemistry used in the Westfield process. She realized that the current manufacturing setup was likely producing components that met specifications but fell short of their optimal performance potential. Without thinking, Rachel interrupted his presentation. "Dr. Harrison, the cure cycle you're describing assumes a standard epoxy matrix system. But if I'm reading the patent documentation correctly, Westfield is using a bismuth imiditoughened system that requires different thermal processing parameters to achieve optimal mechanical properties." Dr. Harrison stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with sudden attention. His expression shifted from polite acknowledgement to professional interest as he realized the technical sophistication of her observation. "You're absolutely right," he said slowly, flipping through his notes to find the specific polymer chemistry specifications. "The imiditoughened system does require modified cure parameters. How did you identify that distinction?" The family exchanged nervous glances as Dr. Harrison began directing his technical discussion toward Rachel rather than Marcus. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly not expecting the consultant they had hired to validate Rachel's technical insights. Rachel studied the process flow diagrams more closely, her mind working through the implications of what she was seeing. The current manufacturing setup appeared to be using conservative processing parameters that prioritize consistency over performance optimization. She could see several opportunities for improvement that would both increase production efficiency and enhance the mechanical properties of the finished components. "Dr. Harrison," she continued, her voice gaining confidence as she worked through the technical analysis, "the fiber placement speed you mentioned seems quite conservative for the toe width and compaction system being used. With proper tension control and heated placement heads, you could probably increase throughput by at least 15% while actually improving fiber alignment and reducing void content." Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose significantly as he consulted his technical assessment notes. "That's a very sophisticated analysis of the process variables involved. You're suggesting modifications that would require deep understanding of both the mechanical aspects of fiber placement and the thermal processing requirements for optimization." Marcus attempted to regain control of the conversation with obvious desperation. "Dr. Harrison, perhaps we could focus on the broader technical requirements rather than getting lost in specific process details that Rachel has obviously been cramming on since the inheritance announcement." But Dr. Harrison was now genuinely interested in Rachel's technical perspective and continued directing his questions toward her. "What's your assessment of the current quality control methodology for detecting delaminations and porosity in the finished components?" he asked, pointing to inspection protocols that filled several pages of dense technical documentation. Rachel studied the quality control procedures with growing concern about what she was seeing. The current inspection approach relied heavily on ultrasonic testing performed after complete cure cycles, which meant that defects could only be detected after significant processing time and material costs had already been invested. "The post-cure inspection strategy seems problematic from both cost and quality perspectives," she replied thoughtfully. "You're only catching defects after the full manufacturing investment has been made. A real-time monitoring approach using embedded fiber optic sensors or thermographic imaging during the cure cycle would allow for immediate process adjustments and significant material savings." Dr. Harrison stared at her with obvious amazement. "That's exactly the recommendation I was planning to make in my assessment report. In-process monitoring represents the next generation of composite manufacturing quality assurance." The fact that you immediately recognized both the limitations of the current approach and the most promising solution indicates a very sophisticated understanding of advanced manufacturing systems. Vivian's voice carried a note of panic as she attempted to interrupt the technical discussion that was rapidly spinning beyond the family's control. "This is all very interesting, but surely we're getting too deep into technical details that don't really matter for overall business management decisions." But Rachel was now completely absorbed in analyzing the manufacturing processes, her mind working through problems and solutions with the focused intensity that had always driven her to excel in technical challenges. She began identifying additional optimization opportunities in material handling, process automation, and production scheduling that demonstrated understanding not just of individual technologies, but of how complex manufacturing systems functioned as integrated operations. Dr. Harrison found himself taking notes on Rachel's suggestions, clearly recognizing insights that could significantly improve the company's operational efficiency and product quality. Her analysis revealed understanding of aerospace materials science, advanced manufacturing processes, and systems integration that exceeded what he had expected from anyone without extensive engineering education and industry experience. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position. Look, anyone can memorize some technical terminology, but actually managing these operations requires strategic thinking and business acumen that you can't get from reading manufacturing manuals. Rachel looked up from the technical documentation, her eyes meeting his with quiet authority that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including herself. Marcus, these aren't memorized terms. Process optimization and quality control are fundamental engineering disciplines that I've been working with for years. The only difference here is the specific materials and tolerances involved, but the underlying principles are exactly the same whether you're manufacturing aerospace components or any other precision products. Dr. Harrison closed his assessment folder and looked directly at Rachel with obvious professional respect. I have to say, the level of technical insight you've demonstrated today suggests someone with extensive background in advanced manufacturing engineering. Your understanding of process variables, quality control methodologies, and systems optimization indicates the kind of expertise that typically requires advanced education and significant industry experience. The silence that followed was deafening as the family finally began to understand that their fundamental assumptions about Rachel's qualifications might be not just wrong, but catastrophically misguided. The atmosphere in the conference room had shifted dramatically over the past hour, and Marcus could feel his carefully constructed narrative crumbling with each technical insight that Rachel demonstrated. Dr. Harrison's obvious respect for her expertise was undermining everything the family had planned, and desperate times called for increasingly desperate measures. Catherine stood abruptly from her chair, her voice cutting through the technical discussion with sharp authority. This has gone far enough. I don't care how many technical terms someone has memorized or how many lucky guesses they can make about manufacturing processes. We're talking about a multi-generational family legacy that cannot be entrusted to someone whose highest educational achievement is a certificate from a community technical program. Her words hung in the air like poison, designed to reassert the educational hierarchy that had always defined the family's sense of superiority. Rachel felt the familiar sting of class-based humiliation, but something had changed during the technical discussion with Dr. Harrison. For the first time in years, she had been treated as an intellectual equal by someone whose expertise was unquestionable. Marcus seized on his sister's attack with renewed confidence. Exactly. Catherine studied at Harvard Business School, I have my Wharton MBA, and Vivian graduated summa cum laude from Vassar. We understand the kind of sophisticated thinking that business leadership requires. He gestured dismissively toward Rachel. Reading some technical manuals doesn't qualify someone to make strategic decisions about aerospace contracts and international business relationships. Dr. Harrison looked uncomfortable as the family's attacks intensified, clearly recognizing that Rachel's technical insights went far beyond casual study or lucky guessing. But before he could intervene, Evelyn rose from her chair with the regal authority of someone accustomed to having the final word in family disputes. Theodore always had a soft spot for hard luck stories and people who reminded him of his own humble beginnings, she said, her voice carrying decades of aristocratic conditioning. But sentiment cannot override the practical realities of business management. She turned to face Rachel directly, her steel-gray eyes boring into her with predatory intensity. Trade school education simply cannot compare to the kind of rigorous academic preparation that sophisticated business operations require. The words were calculated to inflict maximum damage, striking at the heart of every insecurity Rachel had ever felt about her background. But as she looked around the room at these people who had spent their entire lives believing that pedigree mattered more than performance, She felt something shift inside her chest. The same focused determination that had driven her to master complex manufacturing processes now crystallized around a simple truth. She knew more about running this company than any of them ever would. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, obviously struggling with professional ethics as he watched the family's systematic attack on someone whose technical expertise he had just witnessed firsthand. I have to say, the insights I've heard today demonstrate a level of understanding that typically requires extensive engineering education and practical experience. The process improvements Rachel has suggested could significantly enhance both operational efficiency and product quality. Vivian's voice rose with barely controlled panic. Dr. Harrison, you're being far too generous in your assessment. Anyone can throw around technical terminology they've picked up from internet research or factory training programs. Real expertise requires years of rigorous academic study and proven intellectual capability. But Rachel was no longer listening to their attacks. She had begun studying the most complex technical challenge facing the company, a next-generation aerospace component that required innovations in both materials science and manufacturing processes. The engineering specifications represented the cutting edge of what was currently possible in composite manufacturing, and she could see fundamental flaws in the current development approach. Dr. Harrison, she said quietly, interrupting the family's continued verbal assault, the Phase 3 development project for the adaptive wing component. The current design specifications seem to assume static loading conditions, but adaptive wing systems experience continuous dynamic stress cycles that would require completely different fatigue analysis and material selection criteria. Dr. Harrison's mouth fell open as he realized the sophistication of what she had just said. The adaptive wing project represented the company's most advanced engineering challenge, involving materials and processes at the absolute forefront of aerospace technology. Her observation about dynamic versus static loading conditions revealed understanding of advanced structural analysis that few people outside specialized research environments would possess. You're absolutely right, he said slowly, his voice carrying amazement that was obvious to everyone in the room. The current development approach is based on traditional structural assumptions that don't account for the unique loading environment of adaptive systems. Your insight could potentially save months of development time and prevent costly design failures. Marcus felt his world tilting as he watched their hired expert validate Rachel's technical authority with increasing enthusiasm. This is impossible, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. She fixes broken machinery at a manufacturing plant. There's no way she understands advanced aerospace engineering better than our technical consultants. But Dr. Harrison was now completely engaged with Rachel's technical analysis, recognizing insights that could revolutionize the company's most challenging projects. The solutions you're proposing require understanding of advanced materials science, structural dynamics, and systems integration that represents graduate-level engineering knowledge. Where exactly did you develop this expertise? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Rachel could feel the family's desperate hope that she would be forced to admit the limitations of her background. But as she looked at these people who had spent years dismissing her based on their assumptions about education and social class, she realized that the time for hiding her qualifications had finally ended. Catherine made one final attempt to maintain the family narrative, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching their worldview collapse in real time. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Rachel may have picked up some technical knowledge through her work experience, but understanding a few manufacturing concepts doesn't qualify someone to run a sophisticated aerospace operation. We need proven academic credentials and demonstrated intellectual capability. James Morrison pulled out his phone and began scrolling through legal documents with obvious panic. We need to demand formal verification of educational qualifications before this inheritance discussion can proceed any further. If someone is claiming technical expertise that affects the value of family assets, we have a right to examine the credentials that support those claims. Pemberton had remained silent throughout the technical discussion, but now he spoke with the measured authority of someone who had been anticipating this moment. As a matter of fact, formal educational verification is part of the standard inheritance documentation process. I have those records sealed in my office safe, as required by a state law when significant technical assets are involved. The family exchanged glances filled with renewed hope, convinced that formal documentation would finally expose the limitations they had always assumed defined Rachel's background. Marcus's confidence began returning as he imagined the vindication that educational transcripts would provide. "Perfect," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Let's get those records and put an end to this charade once and for all. We'll see exactly what kind of educational foundation supports all these supposed technical insights." Rachel felt her heart racing as she realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. For 3 years, she had endured their condescension and dismissal, allowing them to believe that their assumptions about her background were accurate. But now, surrounded by technical evidence of her expertise and faced with their demand for formal proof, she knew there was no more hiding from the truth that would shatter everything they thought they understood about education, competence, and the relationship between academic credentials and real-world capability. Pemberton reached for his phone to call his assistant, his voice carrying the formal authority of someone about to reveal information that would fundamentally change everyone's understanding of the situation. "I'll have the sealed educational records brought up immediately. I think you'll find that the formal documentation provides some very interesting insights into the qualifications we're actually dealing with here." The silence that followed was electric with anticipation, as both sides prepared for revelations that would determine not just the inheritance dispute, but the entire power structure that had defined this family's relationships for years. 20 minutes later, Pemberton's assistant entered the conference room carrying a sealed manila envelope bearing the official stamp of the Washington State Bar Association. The formal documentation process for high-value technical inheritances required educational verification to be maintained under legal seal until requested by beneficiaries or their representatives. As the assistant placed the envelope on the conference table, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his confidence returning as he anticipated the vindication that formal educational records would provide. Finally, he said with obvious satisfaction, "We'll get to the bottom of this charade. I'm sure Rachel has done admirable work within her limitations, but let's see what her actual qualifications really are." Catherine nodded vigorously, her earlier panic replaced by renewed certainty that official documentation would restore the natural order of things. "Academic transcripts don't lie," she declared. "Whatever technical knowledge someone might have picked up through work experience, formal education provides the foundation that sophisticated business operations require." Pemberton opened the sealed envelope with ceremonial precision, his expression remaining professionally neutral even as he reviewed the contents. "The formal educational verification process requires me to read the complete academic record as documented by the issuing institutions," he said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. He withdrew a thick folder containing official transcripts, degree certifications, and academic achievement documentation. The silence in the room was deafening as family members prepared to hear confirmation of what they had always assumed about Rachel's educational limitations. "Educational verification for Rachel Chin Westfield," Pemberton began, his voice steady and formal. He opened the first document and paused, his eyebrows rising slightly as he processed what he was seeing. "Primary undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, graduated summa cum laude with highest departmental honors." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Vivian's mouth fell open in complete shock. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Catherine stared at Pemberton as if he had just announced that gravity had been repealed. But Pemberton continued reading with relentless precision. "Graduate degree, Doctor of Science in Aerospace Engineering, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, completed in 4 years with dissertation research in advanced composite materials and propulsion systems. Graduated with distinction and received the Charles Stark Draper Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Aerospace Engineering Research." Dr. Harrison's coffee cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the conference table as he stared at Rachel with complete amazement. "The Charles Stark Draper Prize," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "That's awarded to maybe 1 or 2 graduate students per year across the entire aerospace engineering field. It's one of the most prestigious academic honors in our industry." Pemberton was far from finished. Academic achievements include full merit scholarship recipient for all 6 years of undergraduate and graduate study, research fellowship at MIT's Advanced Materials Laboratory, published 17 peer-reviewed papers in leading aerospace engineering journals, and recipient of the NASA Graduate Student Fellowship for Advanced Propulsion Research. The silence that followed was so complete that the distant hum of machinery from the manufacturing floor seemed to roar through the windows. Each family member sat frozen in their chairs, their minds struggling to process information that contradicted everything they had believed about Rachel for the past 3 years. Catherine's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "This is impossible. She told us she went to a technical institute. We saw her working as a maintenance supervisor. This doesn't make any sense." Rachel finally spoke, her voice carrying quiet authority that filled the room with newfound respect. "I did attend Pacific Northwest Technical Institute," she said calmly. "After I finished my doctorate at MIT, I wanted to understand manufacturing processes from the ground up. Theoretical knowledge is valuable, but I believe that real expertise required hands-on experience with practical applications." Dr. Harrison was staring at her with the expression of someone who had just discovered they had been discussing advanced physics with Einstein without realizing who he was. "Dr. Westfield, your doctoral research in advanced composite materials. That's why you immediately understood the limitations of the current manufacturing processes. You weren't making educated guesses. You were applying graduate-level research knowledge to identify optimization opportunities." Marcus attempted one last desperate protest, his voice cracking with disbelief. "But why would someone with a doctorate from MIT work as a factory supervisor? It doesn't make any sense from a career perspective." Rachel's response carried the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused student. "Because theoretical knowledge without practical experience is useless in advanced manufacturing. I wanted to understand every aspect of the production process before taking responsibility for managing complex operations." She gestured toward the technical documentation spread across the table. "You can't optimize systems you've never actually worked with." Pemberton continued reading from her academic record, each achievement hitting the family like another hammer blow. Postdoctoral research appointment at MIT's Laboratory for Advanced Materials, consulting work with NASA's Langley Research Center, principal investigator on Defense Department grants totaling over $12 million for advanced aerospace materials research. Vivian found her voice long enough to stammer a weak question. "But why didn't you tell us about your education? Why let us think you only had technical training?" Rachel's eyes met hers with calm dignity. "Because I learned early in my career that some people are more interested in credentials than competence. I prefer to be judged on my actual work rather than my academic pedigree." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Unfortunately, that approach didn't work very well with this family. Dr. Harrison was now reading over Pemberton's shoulder, his excitement growing as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. "These research publications are groundbreaking work in composite materials science. The propulsion system innovations alone represent major advances in aerospace technology." He looked at Rachel with something approaching reverence. "You're not just qualified to run this company, you're overqualified. Your expertise exceeds that of most senior engineering executives in the aerospace industry." James Morrison, who had been silent throughout the revelation, finally found his voice. "This changes everything about the inheritance evaluation. If Dr. Westfield has this level of technical expertise, then Theodore's decision to leave her controlling interest makes perfect sense from a business perspective." Marcus made one final attempt to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his assumptions. "Rachel, I owe you an apology. I obviously misunderstood your background and qualifications. Perhaps we could discuss how to structure a collaborative management approach that utilizes everyone's strengths." But Rachel's response carried the authority of someone who no longer needed to seek approval from people who had systematically underestimated her. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but I think Theodore's intentions were quite clear. The company needs technical leadership that understands both advanced engineering principles and practical manufacturing applications." She looked around the table at the faces that had once dismissed her with such casual cruelty. "I believe I'm uniquely qualified to provide that leadership." Dr. Harrison closed the academic documentation and addressed Rachel with obvious professional respect. "Dr. Westfield, I hope you'll consider my consulting firm for any external technical support you might need as you take over company operations. Working with someone of your caliber would be an honor for our entire organization. Pemberton formally concluded the educational verification process and moved to the final legal requirements. Based on this documentation, Rachel Chin Westfield clearly possesses the technical qualifications necessary to fulfill the responsibilities outlined in Theodore Westfield's will. The inheritance of controlling interest in Westfield Advanced Manufacturing is hereby confirmed without restriction. As the family began to absorb the reality of their new situation, Rachel felt a profound sense of vindication mixed with sadness at how unnecessarily difficult this process had been. She had never wanted to humiliate these people, but their own arrogance and prejudice had created a situation where the truth could only emerge through formal confrontation. I want to ask all of you watching this story, have you ever had your qualifications doubted because of assumptions people made about your background? How did it feel when you finally got to show them what you were really capable of? Share your thoughts in the comments, because these moments of proving ourselves can be both satisfying and bittersweet. Over the following weeks, Rachel transitioned into her new role as majority owner and technical director of Westfield Advanced Manufacturing. Her innovations in composite processing immediately began yielding results, with production efficiency increasing by 18% in the first month, while product quality metrics reached levels that exceeded aerospace industry standards. The family members who had once dismissed her now found themselves seeking her guidance on technical matters that affected their own smaller inheritances. Catherine's questions about patent valuation required Rachel's expertise in advanced materials science. Marcus needed her approval for business decisions that involved the technical contracts she now controlled. Dr. Harrison's consulting firm became a regular partner in the company's advanced research projects, but always under Rachel's technical leadership. Her reputation in the aerospace engineering community, which had been established through her MIT research, now expanded into the commercial manufacturing sector, where her practical experience provided insights that pure academics couldn't match. Evelyn, perhaps more than anyone, struggled to adapt to the new power dynamics. The woman who had once questioned Rachel's intellectual capability now had to acknowledge that her grandson's wife possessed expertise that exceeded anyone else in the family's professional history. 6 months after the inheritance was finalized, Westfield Advanced Manufacturing announced breakthrough innovations in adaptive wing technology that attracted attention from major aircraft manufacturers worldwide. The technical advances that Rachel had identified during that first confrontational meeting with Dr. Harrison had evolved into patents worth tens of millions of dollars in contracts that would sustain the company for decades. As Rachel stood in her new corner office, looking out over the manufacturing floor where precision machinery created components for the next generation of aerospace technology, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. Theodore had seen something in her that his own family had missed, recognizing that true expertise came not from credentials alone, but from the combination of advanced knowledge and practical experience that she had worked so hard to achieve. The family had learned, perhaps too late, that assumptions about education and capability could be dangerously misleading. In trying to protect their inherited privilege, they had nearly lost access to the technical expertise that would ensure their continued prosperity. But Rachel bore no resentment toward them. She had proven what she needed to prove, not just to them, but to herself. Sometimes the greatest victory was not in destroying those who had underestimated you, but in succeeding so completely that their respect became inevitable.